Well, good evening. This is Rabbi Charlie from Ahava Messianic Synagogue in Fort Myers, Florida, coming to you again on a Wednesday evening, the evening when we give a small dissertation of one sort or another. Tonight we're going to be looking at Passover. And so let me open up in prayer. Father, I thank you for the word that you have given me. I thank you that it becomes understanding, that it's easy to understand. And Lord, I ask that you would anoint my lips and anoint the ears that are going to hear it and the eyes that are going to see it. And I thank you for that, Lord. I thank you that you are in control and that your will be done in the name of Yeshua. Well, in the Passover Haggadah, that's the booklet that we use during Passover, there's a section where a young boy asks the father, "Why is this night different from all other nights?" So that's the title of this message. Why is this night different from all other nights? The question is actually comprised of 4 different questions asking, why do we only eat unleavened bread? Why on this night do we eat only bitter herbs? Why on this night do we dip twice? And why we usually eat either sitting or reclining, but on this night, we only recline. The Babylonian Talmud, Sanhedrin 43a, has a writing, and I would like to read that to you for just a moment. It says, on the eve of Passover, they hung the Nazarene. For 40 days, a herald went before him and cried, "The Nazarene is going forth to be stoned because he has practiced sorcery and led Israel to heresy. Anyone who knows anything to speak in his defense, let him come and explain for him." And none was found, and nothing in his defense was brought forward. And so they hung him on the eve of Passover. Now, in Jeremiah 31:22, in the King James Version, it says, "How long will you gad about, O you backsliding daughter? For the Lord has created a new thing in the earth. A woman shall encompass a man." In that same scripture, in the Jewish Publication Society's edition of the Bible, or the Tanakh, it says, "Erect markers, set up signposts, keep in mind the highway, the road that you traveled. Return, maiden Israel, return to these towns of yours. How long will you waver, O rebellious daughter? For the Lord has created something new on earth. A woman courts a man." Now, the commentary in the Tanakh tells us that God is often portrayed as Israel's husband, and that the man commonly courts the woman. But this verse foretells that Israel will turn and seek after God, as though she were courting her husband. While this is correct, it's not the only interpretation possible. The word tasovev is a Hebrew word, and it comes from the root savav. Savav means a lot of similar but different things. Things like to turn oneself, to turn to anyone, or to turn from anyone. This is where the interpretation for Israel's turning comes from. But the root word, sava, when the vowels are adjusted you can pronounce it as sovev. Sovev also means to surround or to encompass. When it is used with the prefix ta, to make the word tasovev, it becomes a word with a future third person singular in the feminine form. Now, please don't ask me how that happens, because that's grammar and it's far beyond me. But I do know that words that describe Yeshua in Hebrew, when he is with the Father, are in a masculine form, and words that describe Yeshua on earth are in a feminine form. And then I know about first person would be me or I, The second person would be you, and the third person would be someone other than you or me. Now, why is all this important? Because the third person singular in the feminine form in this wording can only represent Yeshua. So this verse is saying that a woman is going to encompass Yeshua. In other words, Israel, which is considered to be feminine, will at some point turn and begin to surround and even court Yeshua. That's coming. This verse also is supportive of the scriptures to indicate that Yeshua will be born of a woman, which is emphatically denied by traditional Judaism, or at least that the woman was a virgin, a young maiden. So Jeremiah was foretelling that Israel is going to encompass a man, but not just any man. This man is a future third person singular man in the feminine form. Now, a reflective look at this word could easily see that a woman, a young virgin named Miriam, would be surrounding Yeshua when he was in her womb. But let me read to you Jeremiah 31:22 out of the King James again, only I want to include what I've just explained. There in Jeremiah 31:22, it says, "How long are you going to waver, O Israel? For the Lord has created a new thing in the earth. A woman shall encompass a future person other than a man like you or me." So here we have a double description of a woman surrounding Yeshua, who is the salvation of God. But how can this be? Ever since the Ruach HaKodesh showed me how to find Yeshua in the Torah, I've been teaching and reading the accounts of what has happened with and to Israel with that perception. And we can see that Yeshua was a visible form of God, a human form that had been with Israel all along. But at the time of Jeremiah, we didn't understand how a woman could encompass the Messiah, especially since the people were taught that he had not come yet. How could that possibly happen? How can someone who is here and has always been here now suddenly is going to be born as a baby? This is making us think that he's just now appearing. How is that possible? Jeremiah 31:22 once again says, "For the Lord has created a new thing in the earth. A woman shall encompass a man, a future person other than one like you or me." Now, we know that Yeshua is the Messiah. He is God contained within a human form. That means he appears and is like us. But at the same time, he's very different from us. We are made in his image, meaning that he had to be first. And yet now it was time for him to appear as being born as a baby. Isaiah told us to behold, God was doing a new thing. And it will spring forth, and we shall know it, and it is difficult for us to comprehend. The year that Yeshua died, when all of Israel were converging on the temple to slaughter their Paschal lambs, the priests knew that they had to work quickly in order to be able to accomplish what needed to be done, because there were so many lambs. They had been thinking the same thing about Yeshua for weeks now, because they knew that the crowds loved him, because he had been proclaimed as the Messiah. Even though they were priestly authorities, they were afraid of the possibilities of riots if they waited too long to bring him to the stake. So by early morning of preparation day, he was scourged, and the Roman soldiers held a mock coronation. They had the scarlet robe, the crown of thorns, the scepter, and of course, the acclamations, "Hail, King of the Jews." By 9 a.m., he was led off to be crucified, carrying the heavy crossbeam of his execution stake that they had laid on his bloodied shoulders. The Gospels tell us that on the way, he was offered wine mixed with either gall or myrrh. And so we look at the Talmud again and read what is revealed in Sanhedrin 43a. There it says, Rab Chaya ben Ashi stated in Reb Chasda's name, when a man is led out to be executed, a chalice of wine containing a small amount of frankincense is given to him in order to anesthetize his nerves. As it is written, give strong drink to those who are perishing, wine to those who are in anguish. And he was quoting Proverbs 31:6. Well, since wine makes glad the heart of man, and wine is a symbol of joy. Yeshua knew this, and knowing that he was not going to see joy, nor would his heart be glad, during the Last Supper the night before, he made a promise that he would not drink anything from the fruit of the vine until the day when he drinks it new with us in the Father's kingdom. So the question is, did Yeshua commit to not drinking wine again because he knew there would be no joy in it? Or did he commit to not drink wine because he knew that a painkiller would be in it? Either way, he did not drink a painkiller of any sort. The pain he felt as they nailed his hands and feet to the stake had to be unbearable. But he endured it because God was doing a new thing. Yeshua endured that pain for you and for me. And about the third hour of the day, about 9 a.m. in the morning. At about that same time in the temple, a single male lamb was offered up as a burnt offering, which concluded the morning sacrifice. The Shachrit morning service started at dawn and concluded about 9 a.m. with the morning sacrifice. And about the same hour that Yeshua's hands were stretched out and nailed to the stake, the temple priests were lifting their hands for the Birchat HaKohanim, the priestly blessing over the people. The nailing of Yeshua to the stake was timed by God to coincide with the morning sacrifice, because he was exactly what the morning sacrifice was all about. God was providing an introduction to a new and properly appointed priest to be the mediator for the people to approach God, because the Kohanim priesthood at the temple at the time were corrupt and they had no authority to approach God. What was so special? God was providing a new priesthood through the sacrifice of Yeshua. The Mishnah tells us that at one time, Agrippa the king wished to count the multitudes of Israel. So he said to the high priest, pay attention to the Passover sacrifices. The high priest did exactly that. He took one of the kidneys from each one of the lambs that were slaughtered, and 60,000 pairs of kidneys were found there. And there was not a single Pesach lamb for which less than 10 people had registered. They called it the Passover of dense throngs. I did a quick calculation and came up with an estimated 600,000 people being served lamb in Jerusalem that Pesach. Thousands upon thousands of pilgrims converged on the city that day, along with an unending number of flocks. They were all headed for the temple to slaughter the Passover lambs. The Gospel of Mark recalls insults and mockery of passersby and the utter contempt of the temple authorities toward Yeshua. Again, the Mishnah tells us that for Passover, the normal evening burnt offering started being slaughtered and offered up at about half after the 8th hour. That would be about 2:30, because of all the lambs that had to be slaughtered that day. So the slaughtering of the lambs started early. At 8:30, the Levites blew a shofar in the temple to signal the opening of the gates. Yeshua was just a short distance away, and he would have heard the sound of that shofar. The gates to the temple courts were opened, and the Israelite men poured through with their lambs ready to slaughter. The priests stood in lines, and as each lamb was slaughtered, the blood was captured in a bowl, and it was passed from priest to priest all the way to the altar, to where it was poured out on the altar. The blood of the lambs was splashed bowl after bowl against the sides of the altar, so much so that the channels that were carved into the stones of the floor overflowed from the relentless bloodletting of the sacrifices. As the final lamb was slain, Yeshua was giving up his life. Breathing his last, he cried, "It is finished." At the same time, the high priest would have been saying the same thing as he slaughtered the last lamb. As the spear of the centurion was thrust into Yeshua's side, the blood from him poured out and overflowed the cracks and crevices on the stones below him that it covered. As Yeshua hung there on the stake, arms stretched wide, the lambs were being prepared to go to the ovens. They were attached to pomegranate wood poles, fashioned in a cross, with the arms of the lambs stretched out from side to side, securely attached and ready to be dropped into the ovens dug in the ground. The ovens were pits with flaming fires roaring in each one. But why did they use pomegranate wood poles? Well, because pomegranate is a fruit that has very little flesh, but it has a lot of seeds. The sages realized that when the flesh of a fruit is gone, there's nothing left. It's gone for good. But with the pomegranate, they're almost all seeds. And with seeds, there's always more life. Pomegranates represent continued and multiplied life. So the lambs were prepared and stretched onto pomegranate wood poles about as long as a spear, about 8 feet long. Their arms were stretched out and tied to that cross pole near the top. Both the lamb and the pomegranate represented life. 10 to 15 lambs on these stakes were dropped into the flaming pits, and a grate was placed over the poles to hold them in place. Wet blankets were then thrown over the grates to smother the flames down to a pile of hot coals. And then mud was used to coat and seal the hot, fiery tomb. And they would leave the sacrificed lamb in that fiery pit until they were ready to celebrate the memorial of the remembrance of God doing a new thing that night. Yeshua was taken down from the stake and placed in a tomb in the ground. And the opening was sealed at about the same time that the lambs were being sealed into their fiery pits. Why was this night different from all other nights? Because God was doing a new thing. The Messiah, who always was, at the right time, was born as a baby. He was brought to trial and falsely found guilty, and he was crucified at the exact same time as the Passover lambs, in the exact same similar manner, so that we would understand that everything that was done with the sacrificed lamb was pointing directly to him. Is there any doubt why his ultimate identification in our New Testaments is that he is the real Paschal Lamb? This is what the Exodus story is all about. God providing a new way to bring his people deliverance out of bondage. And on that night, a night that was different from all other nights, the original Exodus became the supreme example, providing for us a foreshadow of what was to come. It was a night that provided a parallel sequence of events, timing, and even picture of the forthcoming sacrifice that would authenticate the coronation of Yeshua, our King of Kings. And like the prophet Moshe said, Yeshua would be a prophet who would save his people from the bondage they were in. For Moshe truly said to the fathers, as recorded in Acts 3:22 and 23. There it says, for Moshe himself said, Adonai will rise up for you a prophet like me from among your brothers. You are to listen to everything he tells you. Everyone who fails to listen to that prophet will be removed from the people and destroyed. Yeshua was the first fruits of God's salvation, the first fruits of the resurrection to become perfected into an everlasting body, capable of standing before the Ancient of Days to honor and worship him for eternity. For without Yeshua, there would not have been a need for the Passover sacrifice. The sacrifice that pointed to the forthcoming advancement of Yeshua's birth, death, burial, and resurrection, the sacrifice to end all sacrifices. After that night of God continuing a new thing through the sacrifice of Messiah, it was only a few short years later that the temple was destroyed and the sacrificial system was removed from Israel because it was no longer necessary. Since the fulfillment of the reason for the sacrifices that pointed toward Yeshua, there was no need for the sacrifices to continue. And God knew that this was about to take place because he arranged for that temple to be destroyed. And again, he was doing another new thing, eliminating the temple because it just wasn't needed anymore. The ultimate sacrifice of the visible image of God, willingly sacrificing himself so that we could be freed from the burden of sin. There's a poignant account in the Talmud. It tells us about a crimson cord that the priests would tack onto the temple doorpost every Yom Kippur. And throughout the course of the day, that crimson cord would turn white, the day being Yom Kippur. It would turn white as evidence that God had forgiven the sins of Israel through the ritual sacrifices, prayers, and holy worship that they spent in time before the Lord. But after Yeshua was crucified, year after year, for almost 40 years, that crimson cord never again turned white. It's because the sacrificial system that God originated, which foreshadowed the sacrifice that Yeshua the Messiah would go through, was completed through Yeshua's sacrifice. So the sacrifices that the priests were offering were no longer accepted by God. The crimson cord that never turned white again during Yom Kippur was God's message that he was no longer accepting sacrifices because, as Samuel reported in 1 Samuel 15:22, he said, the Lord no longer delights in sacrifices. He wants us to obey rather than sacrifice. Why is this night different than all other nights? Because throughout history, God has been doing a new thing. And Yeshua has always been at the center of all that he has done. And praise be to our God, he continues to be the reason tonight is different than all other nights. Tonight being the Passover night. And part of the Seder is the question, why is this night different than all other nights? Now, that concludes the message. It was not a long message, but I think it was an important message. So if there's any questions, I ask you to bring the questions up. You can bring a question up either by unmuting and asking the question, or you can send us a text by way of chat. And I see we have no questions in chat. Well, that makes my night even easier. I was expecting maybe we'd get some questions, but praise be to God. I'm Rabbi Charlie Edwards of Ahava Messianic Synagogue in Fort Myers, Florida.